Last week, normies spent a lot of time in between our Wednesday episodes freaking out about price. Now, like then, there are still those who haven't gotten used to Bitcoin's price volatility and are currently in crisis mode again, despite the fact that Bitcoin is still above 100,000 US dollars, which would have been considered the moon not that very long ago. In the meantime, I am absolutely thrilled that Bitcoin is still as cheap as it is, and that we are going to be able to add to our stack today before Bitcoin really starts ripping.
This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy.
Guten Tag, buenos dias, morgen, and welcome to episode 194 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Next DCA Wednesday falls on Christmas Day, so I'm not 100% certain about how I'm going to handle that. One thing is for sure, though, and that is I will be making my weekly DCA stack on time. I just haven't determined if I'm going to be able to record that day. In the meantime, I am back in the studio here on the usually sunny Florida Space Coast. We had a real soaker last night and apparently had a rainstorm after rainstorm while I was off enjoying the high desert of New Mexico for a week or so. It has been exactly 2 weeks since Bitcoin broke through that $100,000 US dollar mark for the first time ever. And if you recall, it did so while I was recording episode 192 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. So that was certainly exciting. It does seem, looking back on it, I mean, that was only 2 episodes ago, only 2 weeks ago, but it certainly does seem that 100,000 US dollars is old news already. It's amazing how fast our perception of Bitcoin's price, Bitcoin's US dollar value at least, changes. We set a new all-time high and all of a sudden our brain puts that as kind of like the new baseline, even though we know that Bitcoin runs in cycles and there's certainly those retracements, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself as usual. Anyway, we will definitely be talking about price in the news section of the podcast, but before we do, let us take that customary look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. At the time of this recording, we are sitting at a block height of 875,367, and Bitcoin is clocking in at a US dollar price of $100,760 per Bitcoin. And that means that every US dollar we convert into Bitcoin will score us 992 sats. Bitcoin's current price means that we have ducked just slightly under that $2 trillion market capitalization, bringing in at $1.99 trillion, just a whisker below that magic round number of $2 trillion, where we briefly sat last DCA Wednesday. Still one heck of a respectable market cap. And despite the fact that the US dollar price of Bitcoin is down slightly compared to last week, it will cost you almost 1 full ounce more of gold to purchase just 1 Bitcoin compared to last week. As they say, you get Bitcoin at the price you deserve. And today, for gold bugs anyway, that price is 34.8 ounces of gold as it continues to trend to zero against Bitcoin. For those of you who value your wealth in pizza, 1 Bitcoin will purchase you 5,635 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's. That works out to 1 pizza every day for almost 15 and a half years. A heck of a lot of pizza. And that is certainly a lot of food security. That metric that you know has been my favorite for the entire history of this podcast, Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate, is a respectable 4.75 transactions per second, down a little bit from last week's 5.7 transactions per second, which, perhaps unironically, is also indicative of Bitcoin's slightly lower price than last DCA Wednesday. Again, that is not any kind of official TA, and I think staring at lines on charts is voodoo. I don't believe in TA. I think nobody has a crystal ball, and those that pretend they do are just trying to sell you something. But in the over 3 years that we've been doing this podcast, it has tended to work out that when the average number of transactions on chain are up, the price of Bitcoin is going up. And when the price of Bitcoin is going down, we've seen that reflect in slightly lower on-chain transaction volume as well. Again, they say, correlation doesn't equal causation, but it is a fun metric to look at, especially since I've been doing it for weekly for closing in on 4 years now, 3.5 years. Speaking of on-chain activity, the Bitcoin mempool is absolutely chock full of pending transactions, but not quite as much as it was last week. Clark Moody's default mempool is showing 99,754 transactions pending in their mempool, and that is down a little bit. That's down quite significantly from last week when they were showing over 138,000 transactions pending in that mempool. Mempool.space, as you probably recall, has a slightly larger than default mempool, and they're showing 268,728 transactions in their mempool, and that is down from last week. But really, it's only down about 12,000 transactions, so nowhere near percentage-wise decrease is what we see in Clark Moody's dashboard. Interesting to look at both sources of data. As usual, I prefer to have multiple sources of data, regardless of what data I'm looking at, even Bitcoin price, because while price tends to be consistent across all the major exchanges, you will notice, for example, when we talk about Bitcoin's all-time high, depending where you get that data, they're giving different numbers. And last cycle, they were saying that depending where you got your data, they were saying that the previous all-time high was between 66,000 and 69,000. 4 years before that, depending on where you get your data, the all-time high was in the upper $18,000 range to as high as perhaps $20,000 US. And so I think most people just kind of rounded it up to $20,000 because most exchanges showed it just slightly under $20,000. But I digress. If you do need to send an on-chain transaction, it's a little bit cheaper this week than it was last DCA Wednesday. Clark Moody's fee estimator is saying that if you have a high priority transaction that you want to guarantee is mined in the next block or two, that it will require a fee of 12 sats per VByte to do so. And that is down from 18 sats per VByte last DCA Wednesday, which still wasn't too shabby considering the power that you have with Bitcoin, that what you're able to do. You or I might just be buying a cup of coffee, the proverbial cup of coffee with our Bitcoin, or just sending it to our hardware wallet. But, Bitcoin gives you the power to send potentially billions of dollars to anyone, anywhere in the world and have, transaction finality just in 1 or 2 blocks. And to be able to do that for less than $2 US, that's pretty phenomenal. If you have a little bit longer to wait, Clark Moody's fee estimator is saying that a fee of 3 sats per VByte will be mined within a day, and a fee of as low as 2 sats per VByte will eventually be mined. I don't recall seeing any 2 sat per VByte fees go through in the last 24 hours. I know I was routinely seeing 4 sat for VByte transactions being mined in the blocks while I was doing the prep for today's show. So again, it's important to get your data from multiple sources and make sure you have up-to-date data, especially if you're going to try and lowball that fee rate. Mempool.space, as usual, is telling us slightly different story than Clark Moody's fee estimator. They're saying that a fee of just 7 sats per VByte will be mined in the next block. Again, that's generally been the case all day while I was watching the blocks scroll by. There were a few times when it took a half an hour or so in between blocks, and then the blocks had minimum fee ranges in like the 12 to 15 sats per VByte. But as soon as the blocks started rolling in a more reasonable time, that tended to trend back down to 5 to 4 sats per VByte relatively quickly within a block or two. Nonetheless, 7 sats per VByte only works out to 99 cents. And again, the ability to send a functionally unlimited amount of money anywhere to anyone anywhere in the world instantly and have transaction finality within a block or so for just 99 cents is truly, truly incredible. If you have a little while longer to wait, they're still recommending a fee of 6 sats per VByte for a medium or low priority transaction. And they're saying the absolute cheapest fee that you should set is 4 sats per VByte. So about double what Clark Moody is saying will be mined in a week. That might be a little aggressive because, as I said, 4 sat per VByte transactions were getting mined block after block after block all afternoon today and last night as well. I've been waiting to do a little bit of channel management on my Lightning node. And I was going to try and do so last night, but I had something else I got distracted with, and then fees went up again in the morning. So I've been waiting to see if we get below 4 sats per V byte, because I'd really prefer to manage those channels closer to 2 sats per V byte. And I'm not in a super hurry to do so, although it's getting more critical because it seems like the channels that my node has, there's one in particular that I seem to be routing most of my traffic through more often than not, and it's all clogged up. So all of the sats are on one side of that channel. So I can't receive Bitcoin through that channel, and there's another channel that I can't send Bitcoin through. And I was hoping to balance those out a bit, especially since I'm not getting evenly distributed channel usage on my Bitcoin node currently. But once again, I digress. Since last DCA Wednesday, the difficulty that it takes to mine a block of Bitcoin was increased rather substantially. Just about 2 days ago, we had an increase of 4.4%. That isn't the largest increase we've seen, but it's the largest increase we've seen in a month or so. The last increase is 1%, like 1.5%, 1.6% actually. And the increase before that was only 0.6%. So while it's not like that 10.5% or larger increases that we were seeing several months ago, still 4.4% means it's going to be a little bit less profitable for those of you mining at home, at least in terms of Satoshis. As the price of Bitcoin goes up, obviously during a bull run, the price of Bitcoin tends to outpace the difficulty adjustment. So, even though you're getting fewer Satoshis per block, those Satoshis are more valuable in US dollar terms. So again, this is only really important if you are a miner. If you're just a pleb and you're sending a transaction, whether a block comes in 4.4% slower than average or not, it's something you're not even going to notice, because again, that's blocks coming in on average, an average block time of approximately 10 minutes per block. As I mentioned earlier, I saw a block take about 34 minutes not too terribly long ago. And of course, several blocks that came in under 2 minutes apart, separating them. As it stands, we are 1,593 blocks away from the next mining difficulty adjustment. As you're probably aware, Bitcoin does their mining difficulty adjustment every 2016 blocks, which works out to about once every 2 weeks, with that goal of having blocks come in at an average time of 10 minutes between blocks. So we're about 11 days away from the next difficulty adjustment, looking like that's going to be on December 29th. And depending where you get your data, that's currently queued up to be a difficulty decrease. It is way too soon to know, though, because we've had less than 500 blocks mined in this epoch. So that's not really a good sample size to determine what the average is going to be. That's one of the genius things about Satoshi's creation, is that they came up with a pretty solid block time between difficulty adjustments. So we're not chasing that difficulty all over the place like an old school autopilot in an airplane. When it was trying to drive a straight line down the sky, they would drift back and forth, and you wouldn't be going straight. You'd be making these slow S-turns across the sky. And of course, that's not very efficient. You want to be as straight as possible. And the same thing with Bitcoin. If you were to have a difficulty adjustment right now, it would be a decrease of about 0.5%. And then most likely, we're really going to be looking at an increase, because hash power is increasing on the network. Just like the price of Bitcoin, hash power is up and to the right consistently over Bitcoin's history too, which means we would have to double down and have a even more aggressive difficulty increase the next time. And we'd be constantly chasing that 10-minute average and missing it more and more dramatically. By taking 2016 blocks, we get a much smoother change in the mining difficulty adjustment. Again, none of this really matters a whole lot to the average pleb. It's just important to know, how Bitcoin works and why it works the way it does. And the more you know about Bitcoin, the more confident you are in Bitcoin, and the more you believe in Bitcoin, and the more genius you see that the Bitcoin protocol is, and the more of a Bitcoin maxi you become. The reason it is estimating that we will have a decrease in the mining difficulty is because those first 500 blocks or so have been coming in a little bit slower than 10 minutes. Currently, the blocks have been averaging 10 minutes and 8 seconds between blocks. And I do expect that to change, obviously, because the estimated hash power securing the network is up significantly from last DCA Wednesday at 717.3 exahash. That is a double-digit increase in power, 12.2 exahash to be specific. And that is the first time we have seen a double-digit increase in hash power. all the way back to August, since August. So a significant jump in network hash power. And of course, that's an estimate too. Nobody really knows exactly how many exahash of mining power is securing the Bitcoin network. All we can do is look at how fast blocks are coming in and guess based on what the known difficulty is, how much hash power is online based on how fast those blocks are coming in. Real quick, before I go any further with this podcast, before we continue, I want to take a quick moment to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats on a minute-by-minute basis as you listen, or by sending a boost, which is a shout-out via a Lightning transaction, where you can let us know what you think about the podcast, let us know what's going on in your community, or even just say hello. But because it is a Lightning transaction, you are sending value back to the podcast in the form of Satoshis. And of course, that is up to you to determine what value you're receiving. It's not a set amount in either method, either the streaming or the boosting method. And we don't currently have any boosts to read this week, but when you do boost the podcast, we read that boost. Unless you tell us not to, we read that boost on the next upcoming episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. And speaking of our listeners, this is kind of nice. We've got a little more stable, a little more ossification in our geographic distribution of listeners. We'd had a few changes with Singapore, for example, bursting onto the scene in the top 10 countries and then climbing all the way up through the charts to the number 2 position. And as it stands this week, the percentages have changed a little bit, but the ranking remains the same. Number 1 remains the United States of America, where more than half of you are listening from. So hello to all my fellow Americans out there, regardless of where you might find yourself in this huge country. Thank you for listening in numbers that make you the number 1 country. Of course, I kind of expected that when I started this podcast, because I'm in the United States. It's an English language podcast. I just expected most of the listeners would be in the United States. So it's been super flattering to see that really only half of you are. Recently, Singapore burst onto the scene and climbed to the number 2 spot, where they remain, although they've solidified that, almost doubling the number of listens, even though they remain at the number 2 position. So apa kabar, thank you to those of you listening in Singapore. Germany remains number 3. So I was going to say, well, muchas gracias, amigos. So Dankeschön, mein Freunde in Deutschland, for listening in numbers that make you remain the 3rd most populous location for our listeners. Number 4 remains Argentina. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Argentina. Number 5 remains Luxembourg. So Dankeschön, mein Freunde in Luxembourg, or Morgen to those of you listening that speak Luxembourgish. Number 6 remains Canada. When I was in New Mexico, that's in the southern United States, but it's high desert. Where I was 6,000 to 7,000 feet on average. I was on a hill, so if I went to the store, I might have been 1,000 feet lower, and then if I went on a hike, I was 1,000 feet higher. But in general, I was around 6,000 or 7,000 feet for most of the week, and it was pretty cold. The highs were right around freezing, so right around 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit for most of the week. The second half of the week, it warmed up to more like 50 degrees. Still chilly, but not that bad. The lows, on the other hand, were in the teens Fahrenheit-wise, and that's a little bit chilly for someone who's used to being here on the beach in Florida. And I can only imagine how cold it is north of the border, because, when you get to like Wyoming or Montana or North Dakota, Minnesota, we're talking really, really cold, where the winters are bone chilling. And of course, Canada is further north than that, closer to the Arctic Circle than that. So hopefully you're staying warm. But thank you for listening to the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast as you're snuggled up, maybe trying to heat your home with a couple of spare Antminer S9s to make a few extra sats, stack a few extra Satoshis, some non-KYC Bitcoin. But thank you to those of you in the frozen white north for making it the number 6 country in our top 10. Number 7 remains the United Kingdom. So hello and thank you to our cousins across the pond in the UK. Number 8 remains Spain. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Spain. Number 9 remains Australia. So hello and thank you to those listening down under, where you are in summertime. I know that is common sense to probably most of us, but I thought it was kind of funny. Last winter, when the media was doing the media things, trying to make everything sound like it was more extreme than it really was, talking about blizzards here in the United States, and they were saying the weather is so extreme because of why, that while it's snowing here in the United States, they're having a heat wave in Australia. And I thought, do you really think people are that stupid that they don't realize that it's summertime in Australia when it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere. So you would, of course, that's when they're going to have the heat waves. So another major tangent, but thank you to those of you listening there down under. Hopefully you're having pleasant weather as we head into Christmas week. Number 10 remains Mexico. So hola, muchas gracias amigos in Mexico. I cannot wait to get back down there. I used to go to Mexico a heck of a lot more. When I lived out west in Arizona and New Mexico, it's just a simple drive. Now we're closer to Mexico than we're closer to Mexico than I am to, say, Phoenix or Albuquerque, but there's an ocean in the way. Can't just drive there unless I go all the way around 2,000 miles just to get to the nearest border crossing. So you either take a boat or you fly, which makes it a little more expensive. And ergo, it's been a long time. Well, it's been over a year since I've been to Mexico, but what a beautiful country. I can't wait to get back. The world is a beautiful place. All of the countries in the top 10 are beautiful, with the minor exception that I cannot vouch for Singapore or Australia because I've never been there, but I look forward to visiting one day soon. You know, when we are talking hyper Bitcoinization and we're all living in our citadels and we have the freedom that freedom money brings, I intend to do a lot more traveling and hopefully meet a lot of you plebs that are listening to this podcast. So thank you to everybody, regardless of where you're listening. We do have listeners in many, many more countries than just the top 10. I can scroll through the statistics and see that we do have listeners in many, many more countries. We just go over the top 10. Of course, that's where the largest percentile of our listenership is from. But it's cool to know that we have listeners almost everywhere. And when you scroll through, there's the countries that quite frankly, it's surprising to think that someone listening at the opposite end of the world in a country that many people couldn't point to on a map, especially here in the United States with our horrible public education system, and that you're there listening to this podcast. Bitcoin is truly global, and we have a truly global audience on this podcast, which makes sense because it is a Bitcoin podcast, but it's flattering nonetheless. And there was another pop. I brought a new weapon. If you listen to the last couple episodes, you know that ever since I bought this new Shure microphone, I've been having issues where it just drops, for a half a second or two, but usually there's an associated pop and then a cutoff. When I was doing the pre-show audio check, I had a good drop that lasted like 2 seconds. It was just blank air, and I thought the mic had died for a second. So I've done everything I can think of to try and fix it. I changed soundboards. I have a different adapter that I can plug the microphone in, and that didn't fix it. I changed microphone cables. I went back to my old microphone, and that fixed it. So I'm beginning to think there's no way around it being anything but this microphone, which is disappointing because it's a very professional, fairly expensive Shure microphone. And I was hoping that maybe by buying a nicer, higher quality audio cable, that would take care of it, because some of the reviews online said, it's such a nice mic, but it does need a really nice cable to work properly. So I have a really nice cable. I mean, it's more than twice as thick, way more supple than my other cable, and it's the connections are gold plated. So this mic's got a fighting chance. I've given it everything that I could give it for it to work, and it's a shame that I'm probably going to have to return it, because I can't get through an entire hour without the audio dropping out, and that is unfortunate. Hopefully I can, because I don't want to hit pause and mess around with the new mic. Of course, the audio levels will be all completely different if I do that. So let's head on to the news section, and fingers crossed we can make it through without another audio drop. Of course, as is often the case, the price is the news and the news is the price. Last week, literally people were freaking out because Bitcoin had dropped below $100,000, quote unquote, plunging to as low as about $92,000 before, of course, returning to over $100,000. I think it was $101,000 when we made our last DCA Wednesday stack. Then Bitcoin over the weekend went as high as it set a new all-time high, depending what your data. Coinbase says Bitcoin got as high as $108,357. Clark Moody's dashboard says it got to $108,280. So pretty much everyone's in agreement that around $108,000 is the current all-time high for Bitcoin. And then, of course, we had a little bit of a retracement today, but still holding above that $100,000 mark. And with 100,000 seemingly, quote unquote, disappointing, it's amazing that, how many plebs now have their sights set on a million. That $1 million US per Bitcoin seemed a lot further away just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And now that we've crossed the $100,000 threshold, that's behind us, even if we drop back below it for a while, it's a mark that we've achieved. It puts it in perspective that now, $1 million is only 10x from $100,000. And that is amazing. It's kind of like how the Overton window shifts. And in this case, the Overton window is your perception of what the moon is, what an impossible number for Bitcoin would get to. When Bitcoin in 2016 was under $1,000 per Bitcoin and started its run to ultimately 20,000 US dollars, a lot of people couldn't believe that $20,000 was the moon. Like 10,000 was kind of the moon back then. And Bitcoin launched right through 10,000, hitting as high as around $20,000 in December of 2017 before falling back to as low as 3,000 US dollars during that crypto winter. But at the time, if you told people Bitcoin, when you told people Bitcoin, Bitcoin was going to hit on $100,000 in the next cycle or the next 10 years or whatever, people thought you were smoking crack. The same way that people look at you cross-eyed if you tell them Bitcoin's going to be $1 million or $1 billion one day now. But now that $1 million is only 10x away, and Bitcoin is more than 10x routinely in the past. I mean, it's not unusual for Bitcoin to 20x during a halving cycle. So, there were those that were calling for 1 million Bitcoin by the end of this year. It would have to hurry up and do it. Bitcoin is 10x'd in less than a month before. So I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what it's going to do. I tend to be as optimistic as anybody. Maybe Bitcoin hits 1 million by the end of the year. Maybe it hits it by the end of this bull run. Maybe it doesn't hit it this bull run and we only see 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000 or whatever. And then we see 1 million after the 2028 halving. Who knows? The point being, $1 million doesn't seem that odd anymore. And that's really cool. Glock on Twitter posted a pretty funny meme about this. And it's the meme where it's the couple holding hands walking down the street and the girl in the red dress goes by and the guy is turning and looking at her and going, admiring the girl in the red dress, and the girlfriend looking at him like, what the French fried fish heads? In this case, the guy has Bitcoin, the Bitcoin logo over him, and the girlfriend or the wife or whoever she is has 100K stamped on her, and the red dress girl is 1 million. So Bitcoin's already eyeballing 1 million. That's kind of funny, and that's very apropos because I feel like as soon as Bitcoin crossed $100,000 was instantaneously old news. I mean, it was only 2 weeks ago, sorry, that we broke $100,000 for the first time live on the air on episode 192 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast, and already that seems like small change to a lot of us. It's amazing how Bitcoin changes you in more ways than one, not just changing your time preference, making you a better person, et cetera, but it warps your perspective because it really helps you. Once you realize that fiat value is worthless, once you've fully fallen down that rabbit hole, about the history of the Fed, the U.S. going off the gold standard in 1971, et cetera. It's a lot easier to comprehend these big numbers when there's trillions of dollars worth of fake paper out there that people are pretending has value when it has no intrinsic value. And I know that's a bad word, intrinsic value, because that's what gold bugs say about Bitcoin. There's no intrinsic value, but all value is subjective. But Bitcoin's value proposition comes in its freedom, in the fact that it's a protocol, and the fact that anybody can use it, and that value is enhanced by the fact that it has a hard cap at 21 million. It's the world's most scarce asset, but there is no such limit on US dollars, and we're going to see that go into overdrive because we're literally just days away from the next, not budget, but the next debt ceiling fight in Congress here in the United States. Currently, the United States government has been operating with no debt ceiling, with no limit set by law to the amount of debt the U.S. can take on. And that money printer has been going burr. It's been running overtime, and we've already exhausted that grace period. And it's just nuts. The bill that's in Congress right now that is thousands of pages long and does all kinds of crazy, nasty things besides lifting the debt ceiling. A typical pork barrel project. But I digress. Getting back to 100,000 or 1 million Bitcoin, Lena Syka, I think I've been mispronouncing her name all this time. Lena Syka is how I've heard it pronounced on multiple podcasts. She's the the creator of the Littlest Toddler, the Little Hodler cartoons and Little Hodler plushies, lives in El Salvador right now, if you're following her, but she's from Germany. So I still don't have verification on what the correct pronunciation of her name is, but I've almost always heard it pronounced Seiche. It's Seiche, and she's from Germany. She's German, so my knowledge of German says that EI is usually pronounced I. So I would expect it to be like Lena Seiche, not Seiche. But I don't know. Does anyone have any insight into that? I'd hate to be butchering her name over and over, since I do mention her comics fairly often. So I guess it's one of those things where I guess we'll probably have to agree to disagree, because there's some pretty big podcasts, some of the most popular, biggest, most listened to podcasts that are pronouncing it Seiche, which seems foreign to me, but again, I don't really know. But speaking of Lena, on December 13th, so that was what was that, Friday the 13th. Ooh, that was a fun day. I'm not necessarily a superstitious individual, but it seemed like everything that could go wrong did go wrong on what I was trying to accomplish on Friday. But on Friday the 13th, Lena posted a comic, her Littlest Toddler comic, and it was showing the Littlest Toddler and a normie character looking at a screen with a chart saying $100,000, the graph up and to the right, orange Bitcoin graph up to the right, and the normie says, "Wow, 100K, you must be over the moon," and then walks away. And the Littlest Toddler is still there looking at the $100,000 chart, but then a bubble pops up in his head. He's thinking, and he's envisioning the chart saying $1 million US, and while the actual chart below still says $100,000. So exactly what I was talking about, but captured in 4 short frames in cartoon form. So that's the reason I like the Little Hodler, not because they're cute cartoons, but because Lena has a way of summarizing concisely the things we're feeling, the things we're trying to express, and she does it with stick figures in 2, 3, 4 frames in this case. Speaking of Lena, on the 15th of December, just 2 days later on Sunday, she posted a similar cartoon with a similar concept anyway, and it says it's a bunch of Littlest Hodlers partying. They got party hats on, the confetti's flying, the disco ball in the background, balloons going, and the chart says Bitcoin plus $5,000, and it says below 100K. So below 100K, all the hodlers and the normies are partying like, woohoo! Bitcoin went up $5,000. Then it shows above 100K, and the TV is sitting there all by itself with the plus $5,000. The next frame, the third and final frame, the Little Hodler walks up, says, sees the chart, says Bitcoin went up by $5,000 today, and they just said, cool, nonchalantly, like, big deal, just $5,000. So another great cartoon by Lena. Of course, over the weekend, we had quite a pump, part of that being attributed to the news that we had heard that Trump had reaffirmed his commitment to the United States creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Forbes ran the headline on Saturday. Trump confirms Bitcoin reserve plans, 15 trillion price boom predicted. The article references an interview on CNBC where Trump said basically, quote, "We're going to do something great with crypto because we don't want China or anybody else, but others are embracing it and we want to be ahead." So long and the short of it is what he said was basically, he said crypto, but he was at the Bitcoin convention in Nashville, and he did say Bitcoin and crypto. So at least he was making that distinction, but he's just starting his rabbit hole journey, and the real Bitcoin maxis are the people that are surrounding him, like Vivek and others that are very pro Bitcoin that are advising him on this. So I expect him to be in that S-coin phase, like so many people are when they first get into Bitcoin, because he just hasn't done the 1,000 hours yet. There hasn't been enough time. I mean, he'll get there eventually. He is a boomer. He's 80 years old or so. So maybe he's set in his ways, and he's a billionaire, so he really doesn't have any incentive to think outside of the box. But if he follows the path that all of us, or most of us, have on our Bitcoin journey, he'll get there. It's certainly better than the outgoing administration and Elizabeth Warren's war on Bitcoin. So what the normies and TradFi have been talking about all day, the thing that people are blaming for the price decrease, was what happened with the Federal Reserve and the interest rates here in the United States. The Fed had their meeting, and they announced another rate cut today, that they're reducing the interest rates by 0.25%, by 25 basis points, And that is exactly what was expected to happen. But they also signaled that there are going to be fewer anticipated rate cuts in 2025. They're saying that previously they were anticipating there'd be maybe 4 additional rate cuts in 2025. And now they anticipate that it's going to be more likely 2 rate cuts. Again, this is all just a forecast. Nobody knows what's going to happen until it happens. And that also was anticipated in the last several days. It was anticipated because of some official economic numbers that came out and weren't looking super favorable for a rate cut. And that's the reason, according to TradFi, that markets around the world have been tanking for the last several days, and Bitcoin kind of followed in their footsteps and gave up about $8,000 in value, still hanging in there above 100,000 US dollars. So I don't know what the Fed's going to do, and ultimately none of this matters. Bitcoin's going to continue up and to the right towards hyper Bitcoinization regardless. Bitcoin doesn't care. Bitcoin's that honey badger. Bitcoin doesn't give a shit. But a lot of people are worried that the Fed is maybe leaning towards trying to set things up so they're not quite as favorable for the incoming Trump presidency. Some of the reasons for that is that, as you recall, there's some pretty bad blood between Jerome Powell and Donald Trump, with Donald Trump vowing to fire Jerome Powell and Jerome Powell saying, you can't do that. But it isn't just Jerome Powell. There are other Fed board members that are solidly left-wing Democrats, very anti-Trump, never Trumper types, such as Austin Goolsbee, for example. He's currently the president of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. Of course, before that, he was appointed by Barack Obama to be his chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he is certainly no friend of Donald Trump. So the point is, the Fed is stacked with Democratic operatives who don't exactly want to see a booming economy credited to a President Trump. So I'm not saying they would sabotage the U.S. economy. I personally believe they would, but they definitely want to make life difficult for Donald Trump. They certainly don't want, to do anything that might give him something he can take credit for. So in what many blame was the anticipation of that Fed decision, the traditional markets have taken a pounding. Stock markets basically have racked up their worst losing streak since Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. Literally, Yahoo Finance posted ran the headline yesterday: Dow slides for 9th day in longest losing streak since 1978. Of course, the stocks extended that losing streak today, so it was 9 plus 1, now 10 down days for all the markets, with the Dow tanking more than 2.5%, NASDAQ tanking more than 3.5%, S&P 500 was down about 3%. Of course, we know that gold is down almost 2%. That's why even though the price of Bitcoin is down from last week, the price of Bitcoin in gold terms is actually up as gold continues to trend downward in Bitcoin terms. But speaking of Jimmy Carter, I've said on multiple episodes that the world we're living in right now feels an awful lot like the 1970s. I'm not a boomer. I was just a kid in the 1970s, but I do remember vividly waiting in the backseat of my parents' car in long lines for gasoline. I remember the airline hijackings and the hostages in Iran, and I remember the turmoil in the Middle East, in addition to inflation and everything getting expensive, the economic malaise that the media was talking about, stagflation. All these things seem to be a mirror of what's going on today. So it certainly feels like deja vu all over again. And kind of along those lines, in 1978, SNL did a skit, starred Dan Aykroyd, and he was playing President Carter, and he was talking about inflation. Inflation's your friend. And there's a funny skit. He says things like, inflation's your friend. Because of inflation, most Americans are going to be millionaires. Everyone's going to feel like a big shot. Don't you want to wear a $4,000 suit, smoke a $75 cigar, and drive a $600,000 car? And that's what's going to happen because of inflation. And it was pretty funny. So Walker, who's at Walker America on Twitter, the host of the Bitcoin podcast, tweeted that link, and he said, quote, inflation is our friend. Dan Aykroyd on SNL in 1978, perfectly predicting the talking points of fiat economists and MMT cultists in 2024. The thing is, I saw that episode of Saturday Night Live when it came out. I'm that old. Not a boomer, but I'm old enough that I saw that live. I remembered it because I thought it was funny then, and I was just a kid. I was very, very young. But the thing is, Dan Aykroyd wasn't predicting the future. That nonsense was governing the country back then. This really is a sense of history repeating, or at least rhyming. It wasn't just absurdity. It wasn't, comedy that came true. It's not like, the Babylon Bee headlines that sometimes it's like you can't tell whether it's a real headline or a Babylon Bee headline anymore because Clown World has just gotten that absurd. But during the 1970s, there was rampant inflation. There was rampant money printing. There were energy shortages. There was high food prices, high gas prices. We had Vietnam going on. It was over by 1978, but we had wars raging around the world, including the Middle East in turmoil. And they say that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And this is closer to a repeat than a rhyme. I've said that many, many times. In fact, I've said famously that the main difference between Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden was that despite all his faults, Jimmy Carter was at least genuinely a nice guy. And then I thought it was nice that Jimmy Carter lived long enough to see that he was no longer going to go down in history as the worst president of the United States ever. And that may be a little harsh, but I mean, that's honestly how I feel. We really are making all the exact same mistakes. We, meaning our government, is really making all the exact same mistakes we did in the 1970s. It was Richard Nixon who finally pulled the plug on the gold standard in 1971, but it wasn't until the latter half of the 1970s that things got really, really screwball. And of course, we ended up with Ronald Reagan beating Jimmy Carter in a landslide. And then we had the Reagan years, when there are a lot of people that like to say that the Reagan years weren't that great, but they're wrong. The Reagan years were that great. The only people that try and make that argument are leftists. They're Marxists. They're anti-capitalists. And for them, the 80s were horrible because, capitalism really did shine through. And we got closer to unfettered capitalism in the 1980s, to actual capitalism, than we've had at any point in time in this country's recent history. But again, I digress. Lawrence Lepard has a way with words sometimes. He's predominantly a gold bug. He's a Bitcoiner too, but he started as a gold bug, and he does all the gold conferences, or more gold conferences than he does Bitcoin conferences. But he's one of those people that thinks gold is going to be a hedge value and will continue to always be a store of value, but that Bitcoin is a compatible asset, that it's the electronic version of gold. And that's a viewpoint that I don't necessarily take major exception to. But Larry Lepard put our current fiat economic system into pretty good perspective the other day, comparing it to seemingly silly beliefs of the past that the people honestly believed at the time, but that in hindsight we realize were blatantly retarded. For example, he compares fiat to bloodletting. He said, our grandkids are going to look back at this like we look at bloodletting. They'll have the same reaction. Quote, you let the market for money be set by 12 guys who could rig it in their favor? What the were you doing? That was insane. And that's a pretty good point. We see it. We know it's insane. That's one of the reasons we're Bitcoiners. That's one of the reasons you found Bitcoin. But the average normie walking the street, the average sheep, honestly believes the BS. They honestly believe that inflation is only 2%, even though the price of their groceries doubled. And that, 100% is double, not 2%. And while they're living the lie, while they're in the matrix, while they're being the sheep, they blindly adhere to it, kind of like they did with the face diapers during the thing. But when it's over 10 years from now or whenever, then they're looking back at the past. Even the normies are going to go, wow, that really was stupid. We really were that retarded. Speaking of the blatantly retarded, in the category of time wounds all heals, it appears that fake Toshi CSW is potentially nearing the end of his rope. Hodlnot had an interesting tweet this morning, tweeting out, Wright didn't show up to his contempt of court hearing in London, saying he didn't have the money to travel. Strange for a man saying he's richer than some countries. Sentencing tomorrow. Can't see him avoiding prison time after this. Basically urinating all over the court system. So as you remember, COPA finally stood up to CSW and sued him in England and won a verdict saying that he wasn't Satoshi. He didn't create the white paper. He can't make any claims to be Satoshi. He can't continue to sue people for a copyright infringement that doesn't exist, etc. And most recently, he kind of came, in my opinion, really darn close to breaking that court order. But he was also potentially in trouble for perjury, for contempt, for forging documents and making a mockery of the court system, for using the court system as part of his fraud. Anyway, Hodlanot retweeted he's tweeted a screenshot from BitNorbert on Twitter, and BitNorbert, he live tweeted the Copa trial. He was there every morning tweeting out the court as it went, almost like a stenographer. Did a pretty good job of doing it. And so Hodlanot retweeted his snippet of the proceeding this morning where basically Wright just no-showed. And he laughingly sent an email, apparently at 9:39 in the morning, shortly before he was supposed to be there, saying that he didn't have the means to make it. He was too broke to travel to court. And Copa responded they'd offered to cover the cost. They were going to pay for him to attend the meeting. And then he came up saying that no, because there's a opportunity cost by coming to court. In addition to costing the actual money, the hotel, the airfare, the meals, etc., he would lose so much money as an important businessman that the opportunity cost wouldn't be worth it. To which, having a little bit of experience in the legal system in the United States, if you're ordered to be in court, sorry, I would lose too much money if I went to court, has never been a valid excuse. Maybe if you make that excuse in advance, the judge might grant you some leniency, change the date, even maybe change the venue, but just not showing up when you're under orders to show up, when you're subpoenaed to court, not showing up is a crime. So it was already looking like he was maybe going to face some prison time for this contempt proceeding, but just flat out no showing. FTA is what they call it, failure to appear. That's how most warrants are in the if you know someone who's had a warrant for their arrest, usually it's not a warrant. The warrant stems from whatever crime, but the warrant isn't, your warrant is for burglary or whatever. Your warrant is because you failed to show up at court. You were arrested, you promised to go to court, you were released, you didn't go to court, you got an FTA, a failure to appear. And so maybe we're finally going to see CSW face some actual physical punishment for all of the BS that he's put a lot of Bitcoiners and Bitcoin in general through, especially our developers and influencers like Hodlanot over the last several years. One last piece of Clown World news before we move on to that DCA Wednesday segment, and that is out of speaking of the sheep, when I mentioned the face diapers and people standing 6 feet apart from each other, only going one direction down the aisles in the grocery stores, not being allowed to have weddings or funerals because they were complying with these mandates and blindly following what the government was telling them to do, even though we now know that they were just making it up as they went, that they knew that things like the face diapers didn't actually do anything, that the 6 foot distance rule was just arbitrary. But I digress, because here we go again. Just a couple of hours ago, the news broke out of California, and this is a headline from CBS Los Angeles. California Governor Gavin Newsom declares state of emergency over bird flu, calling it a proactive action. California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an emergency proclamation on Wednesday in response to growing concerns over bird flu cases in the state and across the country. The state of emergency proclamation comes after more bird flu cases were detected in Southern California dairy cows, the governor's office said. So not people, cows, by the way. The article continues, Wednesday also saw the Center for Disease Control and Prevention report the first severe illness in a person due to bird flu from a Louisiana case. So we've had precisely one severe illness from bird flu, and it was in Louisiana, but California is declaring a state of emergency. The article continues, quote, this proclamation is targeted action to ensure government agencies have the resources and flexibility they need to respond quickly to this outbreak, Newsom said in a statement. As health and public officials note, to date, there have been no recorded cases of person-to-person spread of bird flu in California or anywhere else. The article continues all the way towards the bottom. Quote, the current bird flu outbreak started in 2022, almost 3 years ago. Since that time, officials say more than 100 million birds have been culled by poultry farms to try and stem the disease's spread. So there it is, 3 years, almost the entirety of the Biden presidency, and a major nothing burger. But just in time for the Trump presidency, here comes the assault on your freedoms and your assault on the economy. And of course, it starts in California. Another example of its deja vu all over again. Again, it's only in California, but that's for now. These horrible, horrible freedom infringing leftist policies They say first comes California, then comes the country. They always use California. Traditionally, they've always used states like California as a testing ground. That's where they float their trial balloons. They hone their policies and procedures, and then they try and push them on the rest of us. So plebs, don't let them do it. We went through this bullcrap in 2020, and they know that's why they were able to defeat Trump in the election, because he was looking untouchable. The primaries for the 2020 election were the race to avoid being the guy who loses to Trump. That's why Hillary didn't run. She was saving her powder for when she, could. That's why Hillary didn't run a second time. She was saving her powder for when she had a more easy race to win. He was so strong in the polls. His approval rating was through the roof. Every demographic in the United States is doing better than they ever had, especially in minority neighborhoods. And they just didn't think they could win. Their polling told them they couldn't win. And so we had a bunch of nobodies and has-beens like Biden just kind of playing the game, jockeying for the nomination to set up to be the fall guy. And then voila, the virus changed all of that. His popularity sank to where he was vulnerable, and we ended up where we are now. So out comes the same old playbook, and this time it's bird flu, apparently. All right, on to what makes today and every Wednesday so special, and that is, of course, that today is DCA Wednesday. What is DCA, you might ask? Well, DCA is short for dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals, regardless of price. For example, this is going to be our 178th stack. We chose an equal portion of just $20 US so we could keep it simple, so we could keep it relatable. Of course, this is a you do you thing. If you were Michael Saylor, for example, you're not going to just stack $20 a week. You'll stack much, much more. But I wanted to show that regardless of who you are and where you're listening, if you can come up with just $20 a week, that you can eventually build a reasonably sized stack, a reasonably good sized stack of Satoshis. So our equal portion was $20. Our regular interval, of course, was weekly on Wednesdays. And in those 178 Wednesdays, we've converted $20 US of fiat, a total of 3,540 at $20 at a time, into a stack of more than 10 million Satoshis. We're going to do that again today. To do so, we're going to use the handy dandy Cash App. Cash App is not a sponsor of the show. As you know, I've been using Cash App this entire podcast because I think they're super easy. They don't have the cheapest fees, but there are things about Cash App that other services don't let you do. Like Cash App would let me transfer money into Cash App right now instantly, buy Bitcoin with it instantly, and transfer it to my wallet instantly. And when I do so, if I'm willing to wait a little while for the transfer, last time I did that, it was minutes, but they say up to 24 hours, then I can do it for free. Whereas when I used Coinbase, they would initially not let you purchase any Bitcoin until your funds had settled, and that was like 5 to 10 business days. Then they changed it to where I could buy Bitcoin with the money, but you couldn't transfer it till they guaranteed that your funds had settled. And then when you do transfer it to your self-custody, they charge you a mining fee, which is always significantly more than what the mining fee estimators I look at say the fee should be. And they always way overestimate the fee. So if they charge you $5 in mining fees to move your Bitcoin, that totally makes up for the fact we're going to pay a little bit more in purchasing fees using Cash App. Again, not a sponsor of the show. This is a you do you thing. Cash App's probably not even available where you're listening because half of you are not in the United States, and Cash App is predominantly for the United States at this time. But if you are in the United States and you want to give Cash App a try, there is a referral code in the show notes. There's several referral codes for services that I use. Again, none of them are sponsors. Everybody that uses these products gets their own custom referral code to give to friends and family. But if you do sign up for Cash App or Fold or any of the other services that I have a referral code for, it would be silly not to use the referral code because you'll get some Satoshis or some dollars for free for signing up that you wouldn't get if you don't use that code. But I digress. And I already have Cash App open. I already have $20 on Cash App because I needed to reimburse somebody for parking at the airport. And I had a little bit more money than I needed to do so in Cash App. So all I have to do is tap Bitcoin, tap buy, enter $20, tap confirm, and boom, just like that, we've added another 19,446 sats to our stack. because the price is just a little bit cheaper than it was last DC Wednesday. We stacked about 90 to 95 sats more for that $20 than we did last week. So that is nice. It's a little painful buying Bitcoin over $100,000 right now, but I remind you, when Bitcoin's $1 million, people are going to be calling you lucky for stacking at just 100,000 US dollars. And that's one of the reasons we DCA, is because by buying at a fixed interval, we've bought the bottoms, we bought the tops, we bought everywhere in between, but most importantly, we've bought for an average purchase price now of $34,791.20, and that is significantly better than the current price of $100,535 where we just purchased. Perhaps most importantly, that 19,000 sats brings our stack up to 10,232,474 sats, significantly more Satoshis by a factor of 10 more than the average person in the world will ever hope to be able to accumulate for their family when we do see hyper-Bitcoinization. So that is really cool. And perhaps equally importantly, for those of you, especially just beginning this journey, where we're still in the United States, for example, on a US dollar mindset, most people, even if you're a hardcore Bitcoiner, you still buy your groceries and your gasoline in dollars, you get paid in dollars. And so you still tend to look at prices in dollars, although that's changing, and it'll be easier to look at prices in sats as we get closer to sat penny parity. But in the meantime, our 10 million sats has a US dollar value of over 10,000 US dollars. And that is not too shabby, considering we've only converted 3,560 US dollars into Bitcoin. When, not if, but when Bitcoin hits 1 million, this stack of Satoshis would have a US dollar value of $102,324.74, which will be a mind-boggling return, considering we converted only 3,560 US dollars into that stack. And if Fidelity is right and Bitcoin eventually hits that $1 billion mark without adding one more Satoshi to our stack, it would have a US dollar value of more than $102 million. That would put us in the category of those articles they were writing about college kids in 2016 that said, if you'd bought Bitcoin 10 years ago, for every $100 you put in, you'd have X number million now, etc. Those seem fantastical. Like, those were the glory days. We really missed out. Man, if only, right? Those are the man if onlys. But if Fidelity's prediction comes true, and they call for that to happen by 2038, that's not that far from now. I mean, that's less than 14 years. That's only a couple of cycles. If that happens, when that happens, without adding another sat, you will be one of those guys where they say, man, if you'd only put $3,560 into Bitcoin back in 2024, 2025, you'd have over $100 million now. And that's pretty cool. As usual, before I wrap up, I want to take a minute to ask you to please help support this podcast by sharing this episode, by rating and reviewing this episode. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, making sure that Apple has not disabled your automatic downloads. Because if you remember, last spring, they started disabling automatic downloads if you didn't listen to more than 2 episodes a week of any particular podcast. You can also help feed that algorithm monster by following us on Twitter or X. We are at BTC Bulletin Pod on Twitter. I refuse to bow and buy the blue check. I know I see a lot of blue checks out there on plebs now. And I know there's reasons why you get, grok and people are hoping to get enough impressions that maybe they get paid to post. But I'm that's a bitter pill for me to swallow. I don't feel like I can't justify spending money to use X. So because of that, we are a little bit throttled, and you're only going to see our posts about our podcast basically if you're following us on Twitter. So please follow us at BTC Bulletin Pod. Make sure your friends and family are following us. Who knows? Maybe we'll help orange pill some of your family members that, there's that thing where, like, your parents, it doesn't matter how well you've done in life. You're their child, and they never look at you as an expert, when they might look at some moron who has no experience compared to what you have as the expert. They don't completely treat you as a child. They don't look at you like you don't know what you're talking about, but they never quite view you as the authority figure because they're the authority figure in the child-parent relationship. So maybe, even though you are really good, you know your stuff, and you should be really good at orange pilling your friends and family member, maybe listening to this podcast and seeing what you're doing, hearing what you're doing, but hearing it from a third party will help orange pill them when help what you've been telling them, help that message you've been sowing in their heads click. And remember, next week is Christmas Day. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I have not finalized my plans for next week's episode. As usual, I will make sure I do my DCA stack on time regardless, but I may have to do a makeup episode. I guess I'll figure that out here in the next couple days. I have the time because I'm not traveling anywhere, and because of other things that have happened, most of my family is not traveling here. So I have plans, but not so hectic that I hopefully won't be able to squeak into the studio and record. But we'll see. We'll figure that out the next day or two, or at least before Christmas Day. So in the meantime, enjoy your time with friends and family, and remember to be gentle when you do orange pill them. Don't start any fights at this happy season. Make sure you have a very Merry Christmas, but most importantly, don't forget to keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.